She was standing perfectly still. That was the first thing I noticed. Not that she was there, not even that she was alone, but that she was still in a way that people almost never are anymore. Everyone at a bus stop is on their phone, or shifting their weight, or checking the time. She wasn't doing any of that. She was just standing there with one small rolling suitcase beside her and a tote bag hanging from each shoulder, looking at a fixed point in the middle distance like she was trying to memorize the air. I almost kept walking. It was a Tuesday morning and I had exactly 22 minutes before my train, and I had learned over the years to move through my own neighborhood with a kind of practiced non-seeing that I think most people in cities develop without ever deciding to. You learn to look at the world in a way that doesn't ask you to be responsible for it. You look just enough to navigate. And then you look away. But something about the stillness stopped me. I stood there for a moment, halfway between my front door and the corner, and I realized I recognized her. Not her face, her shoes. That sounds strange, I know. But she had these green canvas sneakers that she'd been wearing for as long as I could remember. The kind that looked like they'd been through several lives and refused to give up. I used to see them on the stairs of our building when she'd be coming in just as I was going out. She lived on the 4th floor. Her name was Miriam, and we had exchanged maybe 40 conversations in the 4 years we'd been neighbors. Mostly the elevator kind, the good morning and cold out there and have a good one kind. She had a cactus on her windowsill that you could see from the street. She played the radio sometimes, something classical, something quiet. That was all I actually knew about her. I walked over. Miriam? She turned, and the expression on her face did something complicated. It was the look of someone who had been hoping no one would see them, and also, underneath that, hoping desperately that someone would. "Oh," she said. "Hi." I looked at the suitcase. I looked at the tote bags. I looked at the bus stop, which was 2 blocks from our building, in a direction that didn't connect to anything I knew or to visit. "Are you going somewhere?" She was quiet for a moment. A bus came and went, and neither of us moved. "I don't exactly have somewhere to go," she said. I thought if I stood here long enough, I'd figure it out. I bought her a coffee at the place on the corner, and we sat by the window, her bags crowded around the legs of her chair like a small, soft fortress. She had her hands wrapped around the cup, and she was looking at it with the same careful attention she'd given the middle distance at the bus stop. "I got locked out," she said. "Not locked out the way you lock yourself out. Key left on the counter. The ordinary human mistake. Locked out the way you don't come back from. The way where your key simply no longer works, and your name is no longer on anything, and the person who has made this happen has been working toward it for longer than you knew to be afraid." She told me how it started, and as she talked, the coffee shop around us got quieter. Or maybe it just felt that way because I was listening with the part of myself I usually keep folded up and stored somewhere safe. The part that knows when something real is happening. Miriam had lived in that apartment for 11 years. 11 years of that cactus on the windowsill. 11 years of classical radio on Sunday mornings. She'd moved in when the building was owned by a man named Gerald Osai, who fixed things when they broke and answered his own phone, and came, personally to deal with the leak in her bathroom ceiling one February at 7 in the morning because she'd called in a panic, and he'd heard the panic and responded to it. Gerald was the kind of landlord who remembered tenants' names and wrote them down in a paper ledger he kept in his office like it was still 1987, and who seemed to operate on the belief that housing was a relationship, not a transaction. Gerald sold the building 3 years ago. She found out about the sale the way most tenants in her situation find out about things, through a notice slid under the door by someone she'd never met. informing her that the building's ownership had changed and that future inquiries should be directed to a management company called Verdant Housing Solutions. There was a logo on the letterhead, a green leaf, very tasteful, very calming, and a phone number that rang to an automated system, and an email address that replied with automated responses, and a website that was beautifully designed and completely uninformative. Miriam said she looked up Verdant Housing Solutions the night she got that notice. She said she searched the name and read everything she could find, and then she sat back and thought about it for a long time, the way she always did with things that made her uneasy. What she found was not illegal. A management company with a pleasant name and professional branding, and almost no information about who actually ran it. A business address that turned out to be a registered agent's office, the kind of address a dozen shell entities share. She found the word vacancy mentioned in one interview with a commercial property analyst who described the neighborhood as high value, underperforming, with significant vacancy upside potential. Vacancy upside potential. She didn't know what that meant yet. She would learn. The first thing Verdant did was raise her rent. Not enormously, not all at once. That's not how it works, she explained. It was a 6% increase the first year, which stung but was legal. Then another increase 4 months later based on a capital improvement she never saw evidence of, new pipes, supposedly, though her bathroom still had the same fixtures that had been there when Gerald owned the building. She disputed it. She wrote a letter, politely worded, requesting documentation of the improvement. She got back an automated response thanking her for her inquiry. I was watching her hands on the coffee cup. She hadn't let go of it once. Then her phone buzzed. She looked at it, and something crossed her face. Something quick and controlled. The expression of a person who has been managing their own fear for long enough that they've gotten very good at keeping it off their face when they need to. It's them, she said. She showed me the screen. A text from an unknown number, the third one this week, she told me, from rotating numbers she'd never seen before. The message was short. It said, "The unit has been listed. You'll want to clear the remainder of your belongings before the new occupants arrive Thursday." It was Tuesday. They changed the locks last night, she said. While I was sleeping, I woke up at 6 and went to take out my recycling, and my key didn't work. I want to pause here and tell you something about Miriam that I didn't know until that morning, that I couldn't have known from elevator conversations and a green cactus on a windowsill. Miriam Osai was 63 years old. She had worked for 31 years as a medical interpreter, Twi, Ga, and English, all three fluent, at a hospital 40 minutes from our neighborhood. She had never married, had a sister in Accra she called every Sunday, and had saved carefully over the course of her working life enough money to feel not wealthy, but stable. Secure in the modest, hard-won way of someone who has never taken security for granted. She had no idea that the building she lived in had been bought not by a management company in any ordinary sense, but by a real estate investment vehicle operating through 6 separate LLCs that were themselves nested inside a parent holding company registered in Delaware that existed, as far as she could determine, for the sole purpose of acquiring rent-stabilized buildings, manufacturing grounds to remove long-term tenants, and then either converting the units or releasing them at market rate. She had no idea, because this information is not posted anywhere. It does not come in the envelope with the new ownership notice. It does not appear on the green leaf letterhead. It is available if you know where to look and what you're looking for and have the time and the tools, in public filings and property records that most people have no idea how to navigate. Miriam was not most people. She was careful and she was intelligent and she had done her research, but she was working alone. In the evenings, after long shifts of translation work that left her brain scraped clean, trying to map a corporate structure that had been deliberately built to be unmappable. Her rent had been raised a total of 4 times in 3 years. Each increase was legal, or legal adjacent, inside the technical limits of the law, or based on claimed improvements that were nearly impossible to disprove without a lawyer. She had contacted a tenant rights organization. She had been put on a waiting list for a housing counselor. She had filed a complaint with the city's rent board. The complaint was still under review. The review had been ongoing for 8 months. The locks had been changed at 6 in the morning on a Tuesday. I asked her who owned the building, not Verdant, who actually owned it. She opened the second tote bag. Inside was a manila folder that was thick enough that it had started to curve at the spine, the way folders do when they've been carried everywhere for a long time. She put it on the table between us. Inside that folder was one of the most careful pieces of detective work I have ever seen a private individual undertake without professional training. She had traced the LLC chain herself. Not all the way. It was designed not to be fully traceable, but far enough. She had cross-referenced property filings with business registration records and found the name of a managing partner of the parent holding company. She had found this person's name attached to 3 other buildings in our borough. She had found 3 other tenants in those buildings, 1 through a tenant rights forum online, 2 through a neighborhood Facebook group she joined, who had the same story. Rotating numbers, disputed improvements, locks changed without notice. And then she had found something that she hadn't been looking for and hadn't expected. The managing partner's name was a man I'll call Douglas Vane, and among the properties attached to Douglas Vane's web of entities, she had found a building that I recognized. Because I had seen it. Not because I'd ever been inside it. Because I walked past it twice a week on my way to the market. And I had noticed it because there was a community mural on the side of the building, the kind painted by a local artist, bright colors, birds lifting off a painted skyline. I had admired that mural for 2 years. I had taken a photograph of it once because the light hit it in a particular way. I asked her to show me the address. She slid a page across the table. I looked at it. I looked at the street, the building number. I felt something shift in my chest. I had met Douglas Vane, not well, not socially. But 6 months ago, I had attended a neighborhood development meeting, one of those unremarkable evenings in a community center where people talk about zoning and street medians and infrastructure. And a man had stood up near the end and made a well-articulated argument for a proposed mixed-use development project on a site a few blocks from the mural building. He had seemed reasonable. He had seemed like someone who cared about the neighborhood. He had shaken hands with a city council member afterward, and they had laughed at something together. I remembered thinking he seemed like the kind of person who knew how to be in a room. His assistant emailed me last month, Miriam said quietly, offering me a buyout. It was. They offered me $4,000 to vacate. After 11 years. She said it without heat. That was the thing about Miriam. She said everything without heat. Like a person who has converted her anger into documentation and is keeping the documentation in a manila folder and carrying it with her. Because her apartment is no longer accessible, and this folder is one of the things she managed to carry out. Here is what I need you to understand about the next 2 hours. I called a friend of mine who works in housing law. I use the term friend loosely. We'd gone to school together 20 years ago and kept in sporadic contact. The kind of contact that feels warmer than it is until the day you actually need something. And then you find out whether the warmth was real. I hadn't called him about anything serious in years. I called him then. He called me back in 4 minutes. I don't know if it was something in my voice or if he was just having a slow morning, but he called back in 4 minutes, and I handed the phone to Miriam, and she sat across from me with the folder open in front of her and spoke to him for 18 minutes in a voice that was steady and exact. The voice of someone who has spent decades translating between languages and knows how to be precise when precision matters. When she handed the phone back, he said, "Tell her not to go anywhere. I'm calling someone." What he had heard in those 18 minutes was this: the lock change had been performed without a court order. Without a court order, it was illegal, regardless of any claimed lease violation. And the claimed violation, as Miriam had documented, was based on a rental increase notice that had been delivered to the wrong address and returned undelivered. A fact Miriam had the Postal Service documentation to prove. She had the documentation to prove it because she had started keeping documentation 3 years ago, the day she got the first verdant notice, because something about that green leaf logo and the automated phone system had told her to start writing things down. "He files his injunction at noon," Miriam said. It was 10:47. She looked at the folder. She had been carrying this folder and these 2 tote bags and this rolling suitcase through the cold since 6 in the morning. She had been standing at a bus stop going nowhere because she didn't know what else to do. "Noon," I said. He said if we can get the filing in before noon, there's a possibility of an emergency order. Which would mean, it could mean I can get back in today. Her voice did something at the word today. Just barely. Just enough. "Okay," I said. "Then we have an hour. What happens in that hour I will tell you as it actually happened, without the temptation to dramatize what was already dramatic enough on its own." My lawyer contact needed 3 things from Miriam before he could file: the Postal Service documentation of the misdelivered notice, a copy of her original lease showing the stabilization terms, and a sworn statement, drafted and signed, about the events of that morning. The postal documentation was in the folder. The lease was in the folder. The sworn statement needed to be drafted and signed and sent as a PDF. Miriam did not have her laptop. It was in the apartment, on the other side of a lock that had been changed at 6 in the morning. She had her phone. We went to the library, which was 3 blocks away, and opened at 10. The woman at the reference desk, whose name tag said Petra, looked at us for approximately 3 seconds, and then said "computers free" on the end. "I'll print whatever you need." I don't know why I'm telling you about Petra, except that she is the reason the sworn statement got drafted and printed and signed in 40 minutes instead of the hour and a half it would otherwise have taken. Some people see the emergency and respond to it, and Petra was that kind of person. At 11:51, my contact sent a message that said, "Filed." At 12:14, he sent another. "Motion granted for emergency hearing tomorrow morning. Building management ordered to restore access or appear in court." Miriam read this message twice. She put the phone face down on the library table. She put both hands flat on the table. She was completely still again, the same stillness from the bus stop, but different. The bus stop stillness was the stillness of someone who didn't know where to go. This was the stillness of someone absorbing something they'd been fighting for long enough that they'd stopped quite letting themselves imagine it arriving. "He has to appear," she said. "Douglas Vane has to appear. In court. Tomorrow morning." She nodded slowly. "And I have this." She touched the edge of the manila folder. "I have all of it. I want to tell you what was in the rest of that folder. Not all of it. The hearing was still ongoing as I recorded this, and there are things I was asked not to discuss publicly while proceedings are active. But I can tell you what Miriam had found. I can tell you what one 63-year-old medical interpreter, working alone in the evenings with a laptop and a careful mind and 3 years of quiet fury, had assembled. She had found the names of 7 other tenants across 4 buildings controlled by entities connected to Douglas Vane. 7 people who had received the same sequence of events. Management change, modest increases that were legal, then disputed improvement charges, then notices with procedural defects, then lock changes. 4 of them had already left, taken small buyouts, or simply disappeared from buildings the way long-term tenants disappear, gradually replaced by younger, wealthier occupants paying 3 times the previous rent. 3 of them were still there, still fighting, still not knowing, until Miriam found them, that there were others. She had also found, in a public record filing she'd had to request manually through the city's property data portal, a process that took her 6 weeks of follow-up emails. A document that showed a series of financial relationships between the Verdant management entity and a development proposal. A proposal for a project that would require the rezoning of several adjacent properties. A rezoning that would be significantly easier to obtain if those properties were vacant, or if the long-term tenants in them had already been persuaded to leave. The mural building was on the list. The community meeting where I had watched Douglas Vane shake hands with the council member was 4 months after this document was filed. I thought about his voice at that meeting. How reasonable he'd sounded. How he'd talked about the neighborhood like he lived in it, like he'd walked its streets for years, like he knew the people in it. How he described the development as community-centered, and how people in the room had nodded. The way people nod when something sounds professional and reassuring, and like someone else has thought about it carefully so they don't have to. He needed the tenants out, I said. He needed the properties vacant so the rezoning looks cleaner, Miriam said. 7 buildings, 54 units. If he's done this to all of them, she paused. He's done this to all of them. She's gone. You can stay, she said softly, about a woman named Adese, who'd lived in one of the other buildings, had lived there for 16 years, raised a daughter there, watched that daughter graduate from the school 2 blocks away. Adese had taken the buyout, $4,000, after 16 years. She'd been gone for 3 months, and the unit had been listed the following week at 4.5 times what Adese had been paying. Miriam said it again. She's gone. You can stay. Not at me. She was reading from a text message she'd received that morning from another tenant, who had passed on the word from building management that the offer was still available. The offer was time-limited. The offer expired Friday. She hadn't responded to the offer. She had filed a complaint instead, and then been locked out before the complaint could be processed. The emergency hearing took place the following morning at 9 a.m. I'm not going to describe legal proceedings I don't fully understand. What I can tell you is that Miriam was there with her folder, and my contact was there with the filing, and a representative from Verdant Housing Solutions appeared. Not Douglas Vane, a lawyer in a good suit who spoke in the comfortable register of someone who does this often and expects it to conclude the way it usually concludes, with a settlement and a non-disclosure agreement and a check that makes the problem disappear. It did not conclude that way. It did not conclude that way because of the postal documentation, because of the signed lease, because of the 7 names in the folder and the financial filing Miriam had manually requested over 6 weeks of follow-up emails, because of 3 other tenants from other buildings who had been contacted overnight and who had submitted affidavits. It did not conclude that way because Miriam had been writing things down for 3 years. By the end of the hearing, the lock change had been ruled unlawful. Miriam was ordered back into her unit with immediate effect, and the judge, a woman who had at one point during Miriam's testimony stopped the proceedings to ask her to repeat a specific date, and then written something down slowly, indicated that the matter would be referred for investigation of a pattern of tenant harassment. Not a victory, not completely, not yet. These things move slowly. The investigation will take time. Douglas Vane's name is not in handcuffs. His development proposal is not dead. There are processes and timelines and appeals and all the machinery of a legal system that grinds slowly and sometimes swallows people whole. But Miriam went home. She walked back into her apartment on Tuesday afternoon, and the cactus was still on the windowsill. It had been there for 11 years. It was not going anywhere. I have been thinking, in the days since, about what I almost did, about how close I came to walking past her at that bus stop, about the practiced non-seeing that most of us develop without deciding to, the way we learn to look just enough to navigate and then look away. I had looked away from Miriam for 4 years, not cruelly, not out of indifference, exactly, out of the ordinary habit of a life that doesn't ask you to be responsible for what you're not directly asked to be responsible for. But I had also seen her shoes. This is the thing I keep coming back to. I knew her shoes because I had looked, sometime in 4 years of elevator conversations, looked closely enough to register something small and specific about her. The green canvas sneakers that had been through several lives and refused to give up. I had noticed without meaning to. I had stored it without knowing I was storing it. Maybe that's what attention is. In the end, not a grand decision to see people. Just the small accumulations of noticing that happen when you haven't trained yourself entirely out of it. Miriam told me, the day after the hearing, that she had stood at that bus stop for 40 minutes before I came out of the building. She said she had watched 3 other neighbors walk past. She said she had watched them do what I almost did, the adjustment of path that isn't quite a swerve, the gaze that doesn't quite find a face. She said she'd started to think about getting on whatever bus came next, just to be in motion, just to stop standing still with no destination. She also told me something else. She told me she had not been planning to fight anymore, not because she'd given up, exactly, but because she'd been fighting alone for 3 years, and the fighting had cost her something she didn't have a clean word for. Not money, not time, though both of those too. Something closer to the specific energy that believing things can change requires. She said that energy had been draining slowly, the way warmth drains from a room when the heating fails, gradually enough that you don't notice the moment it becomes too cold to function. She said she was standing at that bus stop because she didn't know what to do, and she didn't have anyone to call, and she thought maybe motion was better than stillness. "And then I saw your shoes," she said to me. I looked down. I was wearing ordinary running shoes, gray, unremarkable. I recognized them. She said, from the stairs. Douglas Vane's development proposal is under review by a different department than the one that handles tenant complaints, which means both things are happening simultaneously on separate tracks that may or may not ever intersect. This is how it works. This is one of the ways things like this survive, through the size and slowness of the system they operate inside. What Miriam is doing now, while she waits, is the same thing she was doing for the 3 years before, writing things down, connecting the names, building the folder. She has been in contact with all 3 of the tenants who submitted affidavits, and through them she has found 2 more. There is a meeting scheduled for next week at the library, Petra's library, with the printer and the reference section, where they are going to sit together and map everything they know. She asked me if I would come. I said yes before she finished the sentence. There is a specific kind of grief in realizing how long someone has been carrying something alone. Not the dramatic grief of a crisis. That kind is easier in a way, because it has edges. This is the quieter grief of understanding what ordinary days cost someone. 11 years in the same apartment. 31 years of showing up and doing precise, careful work in a hospital and coming home and eating dinner and calling her sister on Sundays and noticing, in the evenings, that her neighborhood was changing in ways she couldn't quite name. 3 years of folders and follow-up emails and waiting lists. All of it carried in tote bags to a bus stop on a Tuesday morning. She is not finished. She is, if anything, more organized now than she was before, because now she is not alone. And the thing about not being alone is that it changes the math on how long you can sustain the energy that believing things can change requires. The warmth comes back when there are more people in the room. I think about what Miriam said to me at some point in that coffee shop conversation when I asked her why she'd kept the folder when she could have taken the buyout and left. She looked at me for a moment before she answered. The way she does, quietly, completely. The way of someone who has spent decades listening, because a daisy was supposed to keep hers too, she said. And somebody should. Have you ever been so caught up in moving through your own life that you failed to notice someone right next to you was quietly drowning, and years later, you still wonder what would have happened if you'd looked one moment sooner? And have you ever met someone who was carrying something impossible entirely alone, who you realized, too late or just in time, had been waiting not for rescue but simply for one person to stop and stay? If one of those questions just pulled a specific face into your mind, write their name in the comments. You don't have to explain. Just write the name. Subscribe if you believe the people we overlook are often the ones holding the story together.